just a few days after Christmas, and today I thought it would be interesting to talk about Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, those who come from Protestant backgrounds probably have never thought a lot about Mary, because the figure of Mary does not play a big role in Protestant Christianity, but it does in Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, and that stems back into ancient times. Mary was actually a very important figure in early Christianity. Now, one of the earliest designations to be applied to Mary in ancient Christianity was the Greek title Theotokos, and that's how Mary was referred to in ancient Christianity, Theotokos. That's a Greek word that literally means the bearer of God. In Roman Catholic Christianity, it's usually translated as Mother of God. In Orthodox Christianity, it's translated as bearer of God. It's easy to misunderstand what that means, but if you'll remember that as Christians we believe that Jesus was God coming to earth as a real human being. And that's what we see when we look at Jesus, a real human being, just like us in every way. It's important to know that Christianity does not say that Jesus was a man that had something inserted into him. Jesus was God, but he was God coming into the world just like every one of us came into the world. He developed in the womb of a woman and was born. And Mary was the woman God chose to be born from. She is the one that God chose to be his mother when he came to earth as a human being. And therefore she is called the bearer of God. And that is the reason why Mary is held in such high esteem in ancient Christianity, as the bearer of God. Notice though that it's bearer of God and not bearer of Jesus. Isn't that strange? The reason for that is that in early Christianity, when this title was first applied to Mary, Jesus was more thought of as God and not as a separate being. In Western Christianity over the years, Jesus began to be thought of as a completely separate entity than God. But that was not the case at the first. At the first, Jesus was thought to be identical with God. We see that in the New Testament, in the books of Titus and 2 Peter. Jesus is referred to as our great God and Savior. And so, in early Christianity, the title bearer of God was applied to Mary because it was God becoming a human being. For the one time in history when God would become a human being, Mary was the woman he chose to be his mother. Of all the women who ever lived or would live, that was the only one that would have that distinction. And that makes Mary a unique woman in all of history. Now, you might think, well, this thing, Mother of God or something, has no biblical basis. Well, it does. If you pay attention to our gospel reading today, you saw Mary going to visit her cousin Elizabeth, and when Mary got there, Elizabeth said, "The mother of my Lord." And so that's where, for the Bible, the scripture that is supporting of calling Mary the bearer of God. Now, because of all this, Mary was venerated in ancient Christianity. To venerate someone does not mean to worship them, it means to hold them in high honor. And that's what ancient Christianity held Mary in high honor. There's a scriptural basis for that too. It's found in the Gospel of Luke, when the angel comes to visit Mary and tell her she's going to bear the child. She says, the angel also says that her cousin Elizabeth will bear the child who will be John the Baptist. Then we saw where Mary went to visit Elizabeth, and Elizabeth cries out to Mary, "Blessed are you among women." And in Mary's reply, she says, henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. And that is the scriptural basis for the veneration of Mary. Now that is the things that we get from the New Testament for the veneration of Mary and for the title Theotokos, or bearer of God. Now in early Christian writings after the New Testament period, we find things about Mary that are not biblical, so to speak, but they were accepted in ancient Christianity. There are two ideas about who Mary was. One of them said that Mary's parents were an older couple. They had never been able to have children, which made them subject to ridicule. Back then, if you couldn't have children, people thought God was punishing you for some reason. And so people would shun you. And as the story goes, people were shunning Mary's parents because they could not have children. And so they both prayed to God to have a child, and they did. And they said, if you'll give us a child, we will be sure we dedicate this child to you. And they did. And so they had the child, they dedicated this child to the service of God. And according to one account, when Mary was born, her parents raised her for 3 years and then took her to the temple and dedicated her for service there. There were young girls there who supposedly assisted in doing things at the temple. In another account, when she was age 10, her parents died and she was an orphan, and somebody took her in. And when she reached the age of about 14, the people who either took her in or the temple people tried to find a husband for her. And so the story goes that here was a man named Joseph, and he was a widower. In other words, his wife had died, and he had children of his own. And people were standing around one day, and somebody said, now, God will choose the person who he wants to marry Mary by letting a dove perch on his staff. And so a dove flew down and perched on Joseph's staff, and then he was chosen as her husband. Now, in some areas of Christianity, the belief is that Mary and Joseph never were really husband and wife, in the sense that Mary remained a virgin all of her life. That is called the perpetual virginity of Mary. Now, if you look into the New Testament, you will see where it references Jesus' brothers. And so people that believe this in the perpetual virginity of Mary will say that these were stepbrothers. Remember, Joseph was said to have had children by the first marriage. And the idea also is that Joseph was a lot older than Mary. If you look through the Gospels, you will see several times when we see Mary in the Gospels, and also see Mary one time in the book of Acts, but we never see Joseph in the Gospels after the birth. And so the idea was that Joseph had died by the time Jesus was in his early 30s, when the Gospels pick up about it. And people that believe that point to, remember when Jesus was on the cross, and the disciple John was standing there, and he said, woman, behold your mother, son, behold your mother. But he was turning his mother's care over to the disciple John. And the idea is that Jesus' father was dead, and he needed somebody to take care of his mother, so he turned the care of his mother over to John from the cross. Now, why was it so important for some Christians to see Mary as remaining a virgin all of her life? Now, you may hear the old wives' tale that gets told a lot, I hear this a lot, that Protestants thought it was because Christians back then thought sex was evil, and they didn't want to see Mary polluted by ever having sex. However, Christian writings from back then point to a very different idea. Now, we talked earlier about Mary being the woman that was chosen to bear the child that resulted when God became a human being. That means that Mary's womb was the only womb ever to bear God as a human being. And Mary's womb was seen as being devoted to that and that alone, for the simple reason is that nobody wanted anybody to come back and say later, there's half of Jesus is floating around. You know, there would be no half Jesuses. So that's why people would say that Mary only had the one child, that her womb only bore one child, so there would be no half Jesuses floating around. So another belief that was seen in ancient Christianity was that Mary did not die in the way we die, but that her spirit was taken up into heaven. Now, you know, the Bible reports two people being taken up into heaven. They're both in the Old Testament. One is the man Enoch, and another is the prophet Elijah. In their bodies, they were taken up into heaven. But Mary's case was said to be different. Her spirit was taken up into heaven first, and then her body. Now, the way the story goes, Mary was told by God that the time of her death was near, and she called in some of the disciples of Jesus to come in, and they were surrounding her. And Jesus himself came down, took her spirit into heaven. And this is what is called the dormition of Mary. Dormition. That means death resembling falling asleep. And then the disciples prepared the body for burial and was going to place it in a tomb. Angels came and carried the body directly into heaven. And that is what is called the Assumption of Mary. Her body was taken up into heaven later after her spirit. And the idea for this is that Mary's body was the body through which God would become a human being, and that made her body holy. And so God did not want her body to rot and decay away. So angels took it directly into heaven. Now there's another title that's sometimes given to Mary, and that is the title of mediatrix. That means she is a mediator, someone who stands between you and God. And the idea behind this is that since Mary was the woman through whom God became a human being, she has a special place in heaven, and she has special influence with God. Now, in the forms of Christianity that recognize saints, Mary is seen at the top of the list of saints. And in the forms of Christianity that recognize praying to saints, Christians who pray to saints chiefly pray to Mary. And I want to stop here a minute and consider the issue of praying to saints. Now, technically, the belief is not that the saint will do something to help you. The belief is that the saint will intercede with God on your behalf. And there is a biblical basis for that. It's in the book of Revelation. It talks twice in the book of Revelation about the prayers of the saints rising before God like incense. The basis then of praying to saints is that they will intercede with God on your behalf. Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christianity accepts that idea. Most forms of Protestantism do not. So the idea is that if Mary is the chief among saints, then praying to her would be very effective because she would have a lot of influence with God. And that's why a lot of Christians pray to Mary, asking her to intervene on their behalf. And that way she is seen as the mediatrix. Now, in Roman Catholic Christianity alone, a number of other beliefs developed about Mary. One is called the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and this is related to the doctrine of original sin. Remember, we've seen how the doctrine of original sin developed about 400 years after Jesus, and it says that from the moment of your conception, You are 100% evil through and through. That's the reason, that's because God made it that way. See, God made it so that you're 100% evil through and through. And that created a problem with Roman Catholic Christianity. You mean to tell me that God became a human being in the womb of a woman who was 100% evil through and through? That's what it would mean if you believe in original sin. It would not be fitting for God to associate himself with such a filthy sinner. It would not be fitting for God to allow himself to be raised as a child with a woman who was 100% evil. And so to get around that, they came up with the idea of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And this says that although Mary was a human being, just like we are, God made a special exception for her so that original sin would not be passed to her. God granted her an exception. Remember, God's the one that makes you a sinner, according to that doctrine. So if God chose to not do it, he could not do it. So he withheld that. That is the Immaculate Conception of Mary. A lot of people get the mistaken idea that Immaculate Conception refers to Jesus. It does not. It refers to Mary. Now, Orthodox Christianity does not share the belief in the Immaculate Conception of Mary because it doesn't need it. Because Orthodox Christianity does not accept the idea of original sin. So they never had to come up with a way of not making Mary 100% evil through and through. Now, when Protestants broke away from the Roman Catholics, Protestants rejected the belief in the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And they retained the belief in original sin, but they just sort of overlooked the problem caused by God becoming a human being in the womb of a 100% evil sinner. Protestant Christianity just skipped on by that and just didn't think anything of it. And so that's the figure of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Somehow or another, I think that Mary has been so popular over the years because she puts a human face to everything. It's somebody that we feel maybe we can more identify with than Jesus. You know, sort of would make you sort of have a hard time saying, oh, I can really identify with Jesus, you know. I don't know if you can identify with Jesus as much. And so, but Mary's a little more accessible as a human being that we can identify with, and a human being that we think, you know, we can walk up to Mary and talk to her. If you walked up to Jesus, I'd probably be scared, but, you know, we probably all would be. But Mary is probably a more approachable person. And I think that's one of the reasons why devotion to Mary has had such a long history. I will admit, being raised a Protestant, it's a little hard for me to get into the devotion of Mary, but I don't criticize those who do, because I believe it is a valid expression of the Christian faith.